The house of Richard Gere in New York is more than just an impressive mansion. It's a place filled with a rich history and stories that make anyone who steps inside feel something unusual. Many guests who have visited the home over the years have reported an eerie sensation as if they were being watched by an unseen presence. It's not just the grandeur of the house that leaves people awestruck, there's a sense that the walls themselves hold memories, both beautiful and unsettling. The first strange occurrence began with soft voices. At night, when the house was still, visitors would hear faint whispers that seemed to drift from room to room. At first, people dismissed it, thinking it was the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But as more people experienced the phenomenon, it became harder to ignore. Then there was the antique gramophone. A cherished possession in the home, it sat quietly in one of the rooms, often untouched for months. But on rare occasions, without explanation, it would suddenly turn on. The eerie hum of a long-forgotten melody would fill the air. Its sound soft and haunting, as if it had been waiting for someone to listen. When guests tried to shut it off, they found that the knob was completely turned in the opposite direction, as if someone had deliberately set it to play. The most unsettling part? No one could explain the source of the voices or why the gramophone seemed to have a mind of its own. Some speculated it was a ghostly presence, perhaps a long-lost family member, or an old resident still lingering in the house. Richard Gere himself, a man not typically given to superstition, admitted to having felt a strange energy in the house, though he shrugged it off with a smile, saying it was all part of the house's charm. Despite the strange happenings, guests who have had the courage to stay have never left with fear, just a sense that they've experienced something unique, something that can't be easily explained. And while the voices may come and go, the music from the gramophone continues to play every now and then, reminding everyone who visits that the house holds more than just memories, it holds stories waiting to be heard. As the years passed, the strange occurrences at Richard Gere's house seemed to grow more frequent, and the whispers, once fleeting and soft, began to take on a more deliberate tone. It was as if the presence in the house had grown bolder, as though it had found a way to communicate with the living. Guests started to report that they could no longer dismiss the voices as mere figments of their imagination. They felt they were being spoken to, though the words were never clear, always a haunting mix of whispers and sighs. One evening, a close friend of Richard's, an artist with a deep interest in the paranormal, decided to stay overnight in the guest wing to try and capture whatever was happening on film. As the night grew colder, he sat in the darkened room, his camera rolling in anticipation. First, there was nothing. The house was silent, save for the occasional creaking of wood. But then, a faint scratchy sound filled the air like an old phonograph spinning up. The gramophone. He rose from his chair, walking cautiously toward the source of the noise. As he entered the hallway, the temperature dropped dramatically, the air growing thick with an unnatural chill. He passed through the dark corridors of the house, each step accompanied by the low hum of an antique tune that seemed to draw him deeper into the heart of the mansion. And then, just as he approached the library, the gramophone went silent. The room ahead of him felt unnervingly still, but something in the air had shifted. Suddenly, the door to the library creaked open on its own. He hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but his curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped inside. The gramophone, however, was not the only anomaly he found. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a collection of old letters scattered as if they had been placed there deliberately. The handwriting on the letters was elegant, but the ink was faded, like something left untouched for generations. The strange thing? The letters seemed to spell out his name. He bent down, picking one up, and as his fingers brushed the paper, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, blowing the rest of the letters into the air, causing them to swirl and float around him. Suddenly, the voices returned, louder now, clearer, as though they were right next to him, but still no words, only a sense of urgency, a pleading tone that echoed in his chest. He turned, and standing in the doorway was a figure, a tall, shadowy presence, vaguely human in shape but distorted, as though it had never fully existed in this world. It did not move, but its presence was undeniable. With his heart racing, he reached for the door to escape, but as his hand touched the handle, the figure stepped forward, and the entire room seemed to come alive. The walls began to close in, the floor trembled beneath his feet, and the gramophone, once again, began to play a tune so mournful, so melancholic, that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of time. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the figure raising a hand as if to beckon him closer. And just like that, the house fell silent again, the shadows swallowing him whole. Richard, unaware of the terrifying events unfolding in the guest wing, had fallen asleep in his own room. He would wake the next morning to find his friend gone, his belongings untouched. The only trace of him was the camera still recording lying abandoned on the floor, its lens facing the door to the library. But as Richard picked it up, he noticed something chilling in the footage. A shadow his own, unmistakable, walking slowly toward the camera. But when he looked up, he saw it wasn't him at all. And the music, the same haunting tune that had played so many times before, echoed faintly in the distance. The question lingered in the air. Was the house calling to him now too? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Days passed, but the unsettling feeling in the house never quite faded. Richard tried to brush off what had happened, convinced that his friend must have simply left in the night, perhaps due to some personal reason. But the camera footage gnawed at him. There was something about it that felt off. The figure he had seen in the doorway, the shadow that wasn't his, was it simply a trick of the light? Or something more sinister? Unable to shake the strange events, Richard began to investigate the house's history. He pored over old documents, letters, and journals, hoping to uncover a clue that might explain the haunting presence. The more he dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. The house had been built long before Richard had come into ownership, and its original owner, a wealthy philanthropist named Charles Bennett, had been known for his eccentricities and his mysterious disappearance. Charles Bennett had been an avid collector of rare antiques, including the gramophone that still played in the house. However, there were no records of his death. The last entry in his personal journal was dated back to the early 1900s, just a few months before he vanished without a trace. The journal spoke cryptically of strange occurrences in the house, whispers in the night, objects moving on their own, and a calling that he couldn't explain. Bennett had written of a ritual, something he'd discovered in an ancient text, that was supposed to bring about eternal connection between the living and the dead. The ritual was meant to allow those who performed it to communicate with spirits, but Bennett's journal gave no indication that he had succeeded or failed. A shiver ran down Richard's spine as he read the final words of the journal. Written in a shaky hand, "I can hear them now. They are waiting for me." With a growing sense of dread, Richard decided to visit the house one evening after dark, determined to uncover the truth. He took the journal with him, along with the camera, hoping that it might help him capture any unusual events that occurred. As night fell, the house seemed to take on an air of foreboding, the shadows lengthening and shifting with every step he took. As he stood in the grand foyer, the temperature suddenly plummeted. His breath formed visible clouds in the cold air. The gramophone, which had been silent for weeks, suddenly began to hum, the familiar haunting melody filling the air once more. But this time, the sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing throughout the house. The voices returned. They were clearer now, speaking in a language Richard didn't understand, their tone insistent, pleading. As he moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew louder, as if they were calling him, guiding him toward something. It wasn't the same as before. This felt different. It felt purposeful, almost desperate. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he descended into the basement, drawn by an unexplainable pull. The basement was cold and damp, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics. But something in the corner caught his eye. A dusty, old chest, hidden beneath a pile of crates. It was identical to the one described in Charles Bennett's journal. The very chest that had been used in the ritual. Trembling, Richard approached the chest and slowly opened it. Inside was an assortment of old books, trinkets, and what appeared to be an ornate mirror, its surface tarnished with age. As his fingers brushed the glass, the room seemed to darken, and a low rumble vibrated through the floor. Then, A voice clear and unmistakable spoke in his ear, its cold breath sending a chill down his spine. "Come closer." Richard spun around, but the basement was empty. Yet, the sensation of being watched was overwhelming, and the mirror seemed to beckon him, the reflection within shifting. Not his own, but the shadowy figure from the library. The gramophone continued to play, but the melody had changed. It was now a mournful, discordant tune, as though it was reaching out to him, drawing him closer to whatever lay hidden within the depths of the house. The voice grew louder, echoing in his mind, urging him to step closer to the mirror. Against his better judgment, Richard took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the glass. The figure in the reflection moved, a flicker of motion that sent his heart racing. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to look directly at him. And then, just as his hand hovered over the mirror, a sudden crash echoed from upstairs. The house trembled as if something had been disturbed, something that had been lying dormant for far too long. Richard turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own, trapping him inside the basement. Panic surged through him as he frantically searched for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick with a suffocating sense of dread. The music stopped, and then there was silence, except for the whisper, "You're not alone." The silence in the basement was suffocating, as though the house itself had drawn in a deep, unsteady breath. Richard's pulse raced, his eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but the door wouldn't budge. The wood groaned in protest, as though the house itself had locked him in, trapping him like a fly in amber. His breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the echo of his heartbeat. Then the whispers began again. But this time they were not coming from the shadows. They were coming from inside his own mind. "You don't understand." Richard staggered backward, his head spinning. The voice soft, chilling, had been clear, as if someone were standing right next to him, breathing in his ear. He clutched the edge of the chest, trying to steady himself, when his eyes landed on the mirror again. It was different now. The reflection was no longer just the shadowy figure this time. It was a face, clear and defined, its eyes wide with a strange kind of desperate recognition. It was Charles Bennett, the very man whose journal Richard had read only hours before. But there was something horribly wrong with him. His features were distorted, his skin pale and stretched, as though he were a corpse that had been twisted by time. And yet, there was an unmistakable awareness in those hollow eyes, as if Bennett was looking straight through Richard, trying to communicate something. The air grew thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was closing in on him, pushing him toward the mirror. Despite the fear gnawing at his insides, Richard found his feet moving, drawn to the reflective surface, almost as if it was calling him. His hand brushed against the glass. The cold sensation shot through him like a jolt of electricity. For a brief moment, everything went still. The house, the whispers, the tremors, it all ceased. Richard's reflection in the mirror, it wasn't him anymore. He was still standing in the basement, but the reflection was different. His face was pale, his expression blank, but his eyes were not his own. They were black, endless voids, devoid of any life, staring back at him with a deep, unsettling hunger. Suddenly, a cold laugh echoed through the room, its source impossible to determine. It was as if the laughter came from all around him, vibrating through the very walls of the house. And that's when he saw it. A shadow dark and elongated emerged from the depths of the mirror, a dark figure stepping out into the room, its form flickering in and out of existence. The figure was a twisted mockery of humanity, its limbs long and contorted, and its face, no longer Charles Bennett, was a grotesque mask of anguish and fury. It had no eyes, only hollow sockets that seemed to stare into Richard's very soul. Richard froze, unable to move as the creature advanced toward him, its every step accompanied by the faint sound of the gramophone's eerie melody, now distorted and garbled, as though the song itself had been corrupted by the presence in the mirror. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was both distant and all-encompassing, reverberating in Richard's skull. It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the voice of someone who had been waiting for him. But it wasn't Charles Bennett's voice. No, this was something else, something far older, far more sinister. The shadow figure reached out with elongated fingers, and before Richard could react, he felt a sharp, ice-cold grip around his wrist. His body went numb, as if the life was draining out of him. The room spun, the walls contorting around him, and the whispering voices became a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs, overlapping and distorting in his ears. It's too late now. With a violent jerk, Richard was yanked toward the mirror. His body slammed into its cold surface, and the world around him blurred. The room, the basement, the house, everything began to melt away, replaced by a swirling vortex of shadows and light. He could hear the gramophone again, the distorted tune playing louder than ever, echoing through the void. In that moment, Richard realized with chilling clarity that he wasn't just seeing the reflection. He was being drawn into it. His body was pulled through the mirror, and as he crossed the threshold, everything went black. And then he woke up, or at least he thought he did. The world around him was the same, but somehow different. The air was thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of decay. He was still in the basement, still holding the camera, but the door was now wide open, and there was no sign of the shadow figure or the mirror. The house felt empty, lifeless. But as Richard turned to leave, something stopped him, a fleeting glimpse in the corner of his eye. He turned back, his heart pounding. The mirror. It was standing against the wall in the far corner of the basement, its surface now clear and pristine, as though nothing had ever happened. And then Richard saw it. His reflection. Only this time, it wasn't just his face staring back at him. In the mirror, there was someone else, a figure standing just behind him, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. You've become part of it now. Richard's blood ran cold as he spun around, but the basement was empty. The figure was gone. And yet, the voice remained, reverberating in his mind. The house always gets what it wants. He wasn't sure if he had escaped, or if he was still trapped. But one thing was clear. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed others before him. And it was only a matter of time before it came for him again. The air around Richard grew colder, thicker, as the words echoed in his mind. The house always gets what it wants. He backed away slowly, but the weight of the house seemed to press in on him from every direction. It felt like the walls were breathing, shifting with each passing second. The sound of the gramophone, once faint, now swelled in volume, its mournful tune flooding his ears, wrapping around him like a tangible force. Richard turned toward the stairs, his mind racing for an escape. But as he reached for the door, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. His vision blurred, and his legs buckled beneath him. He fell to his knees, the cold floor beneath him seemingly pulling him deeper into the house. And that's when he realized, the house wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, a presence that fed on fear, on the souls of those who dared to enter its depths. The whispering voices returned, louder now, a cacophony of desperate, pleading words. Stay with us, we need you. The voices no longer felt distant. They were inside him, filling his thoughts, his very being, as if the house was taking root within his mind, devouring his will. With a final burst of strength, Richard pushed himself to his feet. The door, his only escape, was now inches away, but as his hand touched the handle, the house seemed to groan, as though it were alive, angry at his defiance. The door refused to open, its wood warped and swollen as if it had fused with the frame. And then, in the reflection of the mirror, Richard saw it again, the figure, the same distorted face, staring at him with a grin that stretched too wide, its hollow eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. The shadowy form stepped forward, its body flickering, distorting in and out of existence like a broken film reel. You can't leave, the voice said, this time clear and final, reverberating through his entire body. You belong to us now, Richard screamed, a primal, guttural cry that echoed through the empty halls. He tried once more to open the door, but his fingers were trembling, slipping off the handle. It was as if something or someone was pulling him back, dragging him into the abyss. His breath came in ragged gasps, the oppressive force of the house squeezing the life from him. He stumbled back toward the center of the room, his mind spinning with fear, with the knowledge that he could never escape. The house was feeding on him, on his terror. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Suddenly, a sharp, deafening sound filled the room, the unmistakable crack of the gramophone's needle slipping off the record. The music stopped. Everything stopped. And then Richard heard it. A voice, soft and sweet, almost comforting, whispering his name from behind. "Come closer." Without thinking, he turned. The figure was right there, only inches away, its eyes now glowing with an eerie, unearthly light. Its mouth opened wider, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, a grotesque grin that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of what was possible. Its presence overwhelmed him, filling every corner of the room, suffocating him with the weight of its malevolent hunger. "You are ours," it hissed. Richard reached out in desperation, but his body felt heavy, as if every movement was being dragged through molasses. His fingers brushed the cold surface of the mirror one last time. The reflection grinned. Then, everything went still. For a brief, surreal moment, Richard felt nothing, no fear, no pain, no weight. He was weightless, suspended in the dark, in the space between worlds. He could see it all. The house, alive and pulsing with ancient power. The twisted, forgotten souls who had come before him. Their faces trapped in time. Their voices forever lost in the walls. And in the center of it all, Richard realized, was the mirror. The cursed mirror, the doorway between this world and the next. With a sickening lurch, Richard felt himself being drawn back into the mirror, his body dissolving into the glass as if it were liquid. His screams were swallowed whole by the darkness, and the last thing he heard before everything went silent was the faint sound of the gramophone, playing its mournful tune once again. And then, there was nothing. The house stood in silence, its secrets hidden deep within its walls, waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander in. The house would always get what it wanted, and it was always waiting. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.